So welcome everybody to the July 9th Purdue Extension Hot Topics. My name is Jeff Shorgen. Courtney is not here today. I was going to make a joke that she was out spearfishing bluefin tuna, but I think she's on campus learning about some farm management stuff. So Courtney will not be with us today. Our speaker is Doug Richmond. He's a professor and extension specialist in the Department of Entomology. He's given a couple talks for us before. Um, as always, we just enjoy folks coming on and sharing their specialty. As we're letting folks in, if you don't mind, in the chat box, we always like people putting, which county they're from, any sort of questions you've got. We will be using the chat box today, so if you have questions, throw them in there. And without any more interruptions or talking from me, Doug, the time is yours.
Okay, outstanding. Um, Thanks, Jeff, for the invitation. Uh, I, I really appreciate it because this is something that's sort of fresh off of the research side of my program that I can talk about. I'm interested in. It's fun, and I hope you find it fun and interesting as well. Um, so I was asked to talk about prairie restoration today, but I've titled the talk "Prairie Restoration slash Renovation." Because restoration sort of implies that the prairie was there before something else happened. And that may be true for parts of Indiana, especially the western and northernmost pieces of the state. But for the most part, this was a forested area. So what we're really talking about in this context is mostly prairie renovation. That is taking areas that are currently in some other vegetated in some other way, and renovating them to a native prairie plant community. So that's where I'll start. And like I said, I'm going to be talking about mostly about the research that we've conducted. My graduate student Ryan Beard and I conducted over the past several years um, on a golf course setting. So let me just move on from there. All right. So, what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to start with a little bit of background on why these managed areas that are vegetated currently in either turf grass or some other, or maybe unmanaged entirely, why these are really opportunities for converting them into a prairie community. And like I said, I'm going to use one real case study that's fairly new to walk you through some of the questions we ask and some of the results that we think are important and have implications for folks who might want to implement something like this. So I'm going to translate a couple of years of plant and pollinator data. And when I say pollinator, it's mostly going to focus on bees. There's also going to be a little data about butterflies and moths because, of course, they're important pollinators as well. But as you know, there are many other groups of insects that are pollinators, vertebrate animals as well. But we focused it down to pollinators in terms of the bee community and the butterfly and moth community. Um, I'm going to focus a little bit on setting realistic expectations if you should decide to undergo a prairie restoration or renovation project. And then I'm going to finish with some fast bee identification tips and share with you some biodiversity information surrounding bees that you may or may not be aware of. So, the problem that we face with prairie restoration or renovation is that interest in this sort of activity is high, but guidance is pretty darn thin, right? You can find a lot of different resources out there. Not all of them are science-based, some of them are, but I think you'll find that guidance is thin and that it's all over the board, right? There's no consistent sort of rule of thumb when you're starting or initiating a project like this. And lo and behold, that's a lot of what our research confirms. There's no rule of thumb of how this is going to turn out, but I'll walk you through that. So while land managers are often asking this question, can we convert some of our managed areas into native habitat without creating a maintenance problem, right? That's an important consideration. On the golf course setting that we worked with, Obviously, golf courses are highly maintained areas. And so they were really concerned about what this was going to look like. And is this going to be a maintenance problem for us? Is it going to be more of a headache than it's worth? Okay, so that's the land manager asking that question. The public then often asks this question, is this going to look good, right? When will it look like we've intentionally done something? When will we start to see bloom production? And then when will the pollinators actually show up in response to the renovations we've done? So, what we need in that regard is some evidence-based, an evidence-based story that connects the establishment of the prairie with the weed problems that you're likely to encounter, the flowers that you're really looking for in many cases, or at least wildlife habitat, and the insects, right? That's all going to fall in a certain sequence. And it happens rather quickly, to be quite honest. So, part one, I'm going to talk about why managed landscapes matter. I'm talking specifically here about places like golf courses, campuses, parks, and other areas that have managed landscape elements. They often contain underused space that can be redesigned or repurposed for ecological function, right? When I say ecological function, I just mean to provide some sort of other ecological services that the areas weren't previously necessarily providing. So this is all about opportunities, and they're hiding in plain sight. So in the diagram on the left of this slide, I have an overhead view of one of the golf course areas that we worked in. This is the Campen Costler course here at Purdue. And they have some of these out of play areas, right, that were essentially unmanaged, or they were kind of a pain for them to manage. They'd mow them and keep the woody plants down. But this was an area that it provides an opportunity for them to do something interesting and potentially provide wildlife pollinator habitat. So there are always these elements within these larger landscapes, these pockets of opportunity, I like to think of them as. The idea here is that renovation to a prairie can reduce management intensity and diversify the landscape. The challenge then becomes matching the ecological goals that you have through the renovation with operational realities of that space. So the question isn't necessarily, as I have here at the bottom, can prairie work here? The question really becomes, what does a working prairie look like here, right? What does the word working look like? What do you want from it, right? And that's good to have that goal in mind before you initiate a project like this. Partnerships are going to be incredibly important if you undertake an endeavor like this on any sort of large area. Smaller areas, right? You may not require this partnership, although guidance is always probably a good idea. But we partnered up with some conservation organizations. We had the United States Golf Association's green section involved, and they funded the majority of the project actually because they're interested in this renovation idea for golf course superintendents. The Bork Boilermaker Golf Complex, our department, the National Wild Turkey Federation, Pheasants Forever, all played critical roles in providing equipment and actually buying the seed for us to start from. But the critical player, the linchpin in this, was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You may not know this, but they have what they call private lands biologists. And there are a couple of them in Indiana. There's one in the northern part of the state, and I believe one in the southern part of the state. And these folks are incredibly knowledgeable. They have a lot of contacts, and they can leverage resources and provide a lot of guidance and sometimes funding to help initiate a project like this. So I want to say, partnerships, and especially with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, get them involved early if you're going to go and renovate a large area. It's just a really good practice to follow.
Hey, Doug.
Yes.
I'm gonna, in Wabash County, for instance, our Soil and Water Conservation District, they do apply for grants and they actually will provide homeowners with native pollinator seeds and sometimes sunflower seeds. So there's a lot of ask your local educator or myself. We do have little resources, and you mentioned pockets earlier. We have little pockets of resources that sometimes you might be able to get into a program where it's cost effective or research backed, so you're not just going to the store thinking, "Oh, I need to buy seeds." It's a little more streamlined. So that's in Wabash County, but I know others have different programs as well.
Okay, excellent, Jeff. Sorry, I'm clicking through here, but I need to go back a couple slides. Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeff. Yes, soil and water conservation districts. The key here is though you want to get good quality seed from a reputable supplier and somebody who can blend that seed mixture for you um, to make sure it's going to germinate, right? I mean, you could probably buy seed from a big box store, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be very good quality seed. So the idea of reaching out to your extension educator is probably an excellent place to start. So let me start into this case study here. And if you have questions along the way, please just stop me and jump in, interject. So we did this work at the Campen Costler golf course here at Purdue. It's a Pete Dye course for what that's worth to you. But we chose several areas on the course to renovate. And then we compared those areas with areas that were unrenovated as an initial comparison. But we also looked at the differences between renovation approaches within those renovated areas. So we've got two levels of comparison, renovated versus not, and renovation in terms of different seeding methods and different seeding times. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that data pretty quickly. We had our seed mixture was composed of 27 different native prairie species. There's a mixture of forbs and grasses. So showy flowering plants, native flowering forbs, and native grasses like little blue stem, big blue stem, etc. We tried two seeding methods. We used a broadcast method and a drill seeding method. And we also followed two seeding seasons. We seeded in the fall and in the spring, using each of those different seeding methods. So we have a factorial design here: broadcast seeding in the fall and in the spring, and drill seeding in the fall and in the spring to see if any of those approaches made any difference. We also used a contrast timeline here. We had a small set of plots where we condensed the preparation timeline, right, to about 6 months rather than taking an entire year to prep the site before introducing seed. Most of the data that I'm going to show you is from the longer preparation timeline, but I will show you what the shorter timeline provided for us. The things that we measured then as outcomes from this experiment, we measured plant establishment, the number of blooms. When I say plant establishment, how much of the community, the plant community, was composed of the seeded species. And we sliced and diced that in a bunch of different ways. We followed it over a couple years. The blooms, we just that's the pollinator resource, right? So we measured the density of blooms in the area, but then we also measured bee and butterfly abundance and diversity in those areas over the 2-year window of the study. So just on the left here, I have some images of what a broadcast seeder, the broadcast seeder we used, what it looks like, and then the drill seeder. That we actually hired somebody to do the drill seeding. They have a modified drill seeder, which did a really nice job of handling the seed mixture that we have, right? It's composed of, you can imagine, seeds of various sizes and weights. And It's hard to get a very uniform distribution of that without adding some sort of filler into the mix. In this case, we used oats as a filler to help disperse the seed more evenly. We had some hypotheses working at the front end of this study. We hypothesized that the drill seeding actually should improve seed soil contact and favor establishment, especially where that preparation timeline, removing the existing vegetation, was limited. And then we had those two seeding seasons, the fall, sort of the dormant seeding, right before or as things were frosting up and the ground was getting sort of crusty. We assumed that that fall seeding would benefit from the freeze thaw stratification that might improve germination and hence the early competitive ability of those seeds that we put in there with the existing weed seed bank. So those were our operational hypotheses as we went into this study. The first year of renovation is mainly about preparation, right? There's nothing glorious happening in that first year. It's repeatedly trying to get a handle on that existing vegetation that you want to remove and remove as much of that existing weedy seed bank as possible. So site preparation is fundamental. You have to take your time with this, right? We want to suppress the existing vegetation. We can do this through mowing. We use repeated herbicide applications, folks. I'm not sure how you accomplish this. Maybe solarization, and I think Tabby Flynn has some experience with that. So you might check in with her about what she's seeing coming out of her solarization efforts. But the idea is you got to knock that seed bank down and knock that existing weed community down. Then we follow this timeline of seeding and again, either dormant or spring and broadcast or drill. And then that first year, what we measured was the establishment. You're going to see weeds, you're going to see some seedlings, and we did a lot of learning that first year and a lot of sort of spot treating and efforts that were targeting the weeds that did break through. A lot of mowing, a lot of herbicide, etc. In year two, it's more about the structure of the community. You're going to start to see more blooms, and then you're going to start to see the insect response pretty quickly during that second year. And then after that, I move into this mode of translating those outcomes, right, to setting expectations that are realistic if you're going to undertake a project like this. So bottom line here is that successful establishment begins way ahead of the seeding process, right? Site preparation becomes the key. So let me talk a little bit about what the plants told us coming out of this effort. So renovation effects were clear within the first two growing seasons, but early establishment still looked messy and it was highly variable. Sheesh. Okay, so our first data that I'm going to share with you is that this renovation was the main lever for success, not fine-tuning the recipe. So here's just one piece of that data. Here's how many flower blooms we got from renovated areas versus non-renovated areas. You can see, right? This is the flower blooms per linear meter. So you can see right away there in that first summer of the study, we saw an immediate increase in blooms. And by the end of the second year of the study, which was 2024, we saw this incredible flush of flower blooms, right? So those are providing the resources that are going to draw in the pollinators. We saw more native seeded species in those renovated areas. And that was not just flower blooms, but it was higher abundance of those plants, higher species richness, and greater diversity of those native plant species within that first 2 years of the operation. Those floral blooms going to provide resources, and those become visible and a measurable part of the plant system pretty quickly. We also saw less dominance by grassy species over time as we went through the study. So we saw this shift away from that native plant community that was mostly grasses into a more forb-dominated community. Uh, Sorry about that, folks. Um, so one of the takeaways that I want you to come away with from this study is that broadcast versus drill and spring versus fall, that's not the dominant story, right? We did see that, remember, so let me back up a second. Our timeline was renovation didn't start until 2023, fall of 2022, actually. So we took a whole year starting in the fall from the fall of 2021 to knock the existing vegetation out. And then we started seeding in the fall of 2022 and then the spring of 2023. So you can see that, not surprisingly, the fall seeding produced immediate results that were measurable in terms of plant density, how many plants we got from our seed mixture coming up, compared to that spring seeding as measured quickly thereafter, right? We didn't see the effects of that spring seeding kicking in until later in that growing season. But whether you seeded in the spring or the fall after that, it didn't really shake out. There really weren't many differences. And the same thing was true with whether we used a broadcast seeding approach or a drill seeding approach. It just didn't make that much difference. The differences that we saw were occasional and they were transient. So these treatment differences were generally pretty weak, and this operational feasibility then becomes the guiding light of your choice, right? So whatever equipment you have available to you, get out there, prepare the site, spend your time doing that, and then just get after it with whatever equipment you have. That's the key thing. Don't let this perfect seeding approach become the enemy of a well-prepared project, because it just doesn't really make that much difference. Now, let me show you what we saw when we worked on a shortened timeline. So these were in smaller plots, and this was a timeline where we went in and started knocking out the existing vegetation. In this particular case, it was turf grass. We knocked it out in the fall, and we seeded the very next spring. So very condensed preparation timeline. And you can see that kind of shakes out. In that first year of the study, we didn't really see much separation in terms of our drill seeding approach or our broadcast seeding approach. They really didn't separate themselves from the unseeded controls until the second year of the study. So that interference from the existing vegetation community really sort of showed up in this shortened timeline, right? So if prep time is limited, you're going to have to put more resources into that early follow-up management, weeding, mowing, etc., to give those desirable plant species you're after time to become established. There's just that interference from that shortened timeline. Oh boy. Okay. So you probably have already thought about this, but weeds are a tremendous issue when you undertake a project like this. Now, we saw three main weed species, but that's going to change depending on the site you are working with. At our site, mare's tail, Canada or creeping thistle, and smooth brome were the three main weed issues. Now, not all of these weeds are bad, right? Some signal problems that you're going to have to deal with, but some also provide flowers that are good pollinator resources. Canada thistle, the bumblebees love it, right? It's not necessarily what we want in our seeded areas, but it can serve a purpose for the short time, right? It does provide some resources. Smooth brome, on the other hand, doesn't really provide any resources for pollinators. It's a cool season grass, but boy, is it really difficult to get rid of, right? Once it becomes established or once an area becomes sort of overgrown with this, it can really make things difficult because you have to use a selective herbicide approach to get rid of that, to give those warm season grasses a chance to break through, and the forbs as well. Mare's tail tends to be a transient problem, right? That first or second year, it can become a problem, but after that, as long as you can get in there and mow it off, it will slowly dissipate over time. By the third year, we didn't have any major issues with this weed. But weed control and weed management is going to be something you're always going to have to be thinking about and prepared to deal with. And there are experts that you can lean on. Jared Brook in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here is an excellent resource for managing weeds in these areas. He's got a nice bulletin or fact sheet on the subject. And so I wanted to name drop him as a resource for you. All right. So what does success look like? So again, in that first year, expect herbicide and mechanical suppression, mowing of those areas and some bare areas um, to be the issue, right? You're going to have to deal with those, right? You're going to have to put in some labor and some resources that first year, right? This is the stage where things are a little bit visually awkward and it really turns a lot of people off because they think it looks messy. I'm not one of those people. I kind of appreciate the different textures and the colors and the messiness of it all. Um, and if you're one of those people, this is not going to be an issue for you. But most people probably aren't like that. They're expecting things to turn around pretty quickly, and that's where we come run into expectation problems. Excuse me. And that in that first, then, and second year, we start to see establishment taking place. It takes place pretty quickly, right? So you want to look for the presence of those seeded species. You're going to see an increase in the abundance of those forbs. You're going to see more floral resources and a reduction of dominance by cool season grassy species that may have been at the site previously. And then by that second full year of the study, you start to see that much stronger, what I call ecological signal, right? That's when you start to see the pollinators responding. You start to see uh, increases in the richness. That's the number of seeded species that you're going to see and their abundance and diversity, right? You're going to see those pollinators coming into those areas where those flowers are available. So 2 years may seem like a long time, but when you're out there looking at these areas and how these competitive dynamics between these plants takes place, it's not a real long period of time, right? It's actually the very just beginning of that prairie renovation process because this is a decade-long process, really, if you want to do it correctly and if your expectations are set at the right level. Okay, so moving from that plant community, let me tell you a little bit about the pollinators and what they were telling us. Right, we saw those pollinator gains and they were detectable pretty early on, especially when the sampling that we used, the way we detected those pollinators, matched the biological question. And our biological question was, right, are these communities providing floral resources that are attracting the pollinators? So there are different ways to measure bees, pollinators, if you will. One of them is an active sampling approach where you go out there and are either counting and identifying those pollinators as you walk through the area, right? That's a very sensitive approach that you're going to be detecting the local real-time foraging that's going on in those plots, right? So this is going to be better at detecting those treatment differences in our study, at least. And I think um, this is probably what I would lean toward if I was going to tell somebody that they want to measure success in the pollinator side. Don't use a passive sampling method. Like we use this other method, these blue vein traps. These are passive traps. They collect anything that's flying by, right? They're useful for covering broad acreage, but they're going to capture a lot of insects that are just moving a lot across the landscape and are attracted to that nice blue and yellow color. So at the plot level, from an experimentation standpoint, they kind of blur those plot level differences. So the method should match the message, right? What are you really trying to get at, right? I think for most of us, we're trying to get at the impact that we're having by renovating that area, not the impact that we're having necessarily on the larger landscape, right? That becomes a much different kind of question. It's a question of scale, right? So hone in on the areas you're renovating. Look for real-time activity as the measure of success in this case. So in terms of the measurements we took, here's what we saw in terms of Lepidoptera richness. That's butterflies and moths. We call those the Lepidoptera, right? So, and this is just a comparison between areas we renovated and areas we did not. And you can see there's pretty consistently higher numbers of species. This is richness, higher levels of species richness in those renovated areas compared to the non-renovated areas. So right away, we had a pretty quick turnaround in terms of the success of the project, right? We were seeing more species of butterflies and moths in those areas we renovated. Um, that response was measurable within those first two growing seasons. So blooms and structure matter for more than just the bees, right? They matter for the butterflies and moths as well. When we switch to the bees, right, that signal, right, what we were able to detect was pretty strong again, pretty early on. We saw that those renovated areas supported greater bee species richness and diversity. Right? There were ups and downs, and then you'll see in the July 24 timeline, right? Although that difference is not significant, we saw sort of a flip-flop in that. And that's because some of our unrenovated areas had some pretty nice floral resources in there, like milkweeds and other plants that are attractive to pollinators. And some of our renovated areas, there was a nice droughty period, so some of our blooms shriveled in those areas during that time. It's a noisy thing to measure, right? Bee abundance is going to be variable over time. And things like weather, bloom timing, and other factors are going to dictate pollinator activity, bee activity in particular, uh, sometimes to a greater extent than the renovation that you're doing. So don't rely on any one indicator or a snapshot to gauge the initial impacts of your renovation on pollinators. You're going to want to do this over time. You're going to want to be out there looking around, not just on one day, right? Take some days here and there over the course of the growing season. And I think you'll see that those patterns emerge pretty clearly, that you're having success just from renovating. So in this story that we have here, we have these four steps, right? We want to convert these managed areas to native prairie. We expect to see some sort of response pretty quickly, and we do, right? We see more native seeded species and forbs and more blooms pretty quickly. And then that translates into greater habitat quality with those floral resources, greater complexity of that habitat, and then the pollinators respond in kind. So it's not really that this is a pollinator rescue, it's a trajectory toward a better habitat that has that's better quality for wildlife and has more ecological function. So what's the take-home message here? I think most of all, you want to set expectations that are realistic, right? You want to evaluate progress according to the goals you have for that area. And there is no universal prescription, right? If you're converting an area like this just to cut down on maintenance to make it so that you don't have to mow, for instance, right? That's one thing. You can have pretty quick success at that. If you're looking for a sort of a picturesque prairie that's loaded with blooms and loaded with pollinators, that's going to take some time. You're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to continuously come back and measure those things and make adjustments with your inputs of mowing and herbicide use selectively over time. So we've got some practical decision rules that I've come up with here. You want to define success before you even start the project, right? Do you just want aesthetic improvements? Do you want pollinator habitat? Do you want reduced mowing? Do you want demonstration value from these plots, right? What is the end game for doing something like this? Secondly, then, you need to invest in preparation of the site, right? Existing vegetation and weed pressure are the first and main constraints on success. So getting rid of as much of that existing plant community as you can before you start seeding or plugging is key. Third, then, choose a feasible seeding method, right? Broadcast may be fine on a well-prepared site, right? Drilling may help on a short timeline, but in the long in the long view, it doesn't really matter what method you use as long as you have a well-prepared site. We did not see any clear differences in terms of timing of the seeding or the method we used. And then in the first 2 years, expect to be mowing some of those areas to keep the thistle out, for instance, to keep it from going to seed. Um, Broadcast and spot weed control using selective uh, herbicides and spot treatment with non-selective herbicides. And then patience, right? That's all part of the plan. And then the fifth point in this checklist, I think, is monitoring. Choose something simple that fits your goals, but be consistent, right? Track the seeded species, track the number of blooms, track the problem weeds that you encounter and insect activity over time. Don't just rely on one snapshot, or you could be disappointed, and your disappointment may be for naught because you're likely going to have some success if you stick with it. Okay, now Jeff mentioned to me that I might want to touch a little bit on identification, insect identification, um, because I think this is interesting. Um, I don't know how many of you realize this, but there are about 2,400 species of bees in North America, right? It's not just honeybees and bumblebees. There are a lot of different species of what we call bees. And what makes a bee? A bee is pollen specific carrying structures on their body, right? Um, in Indiana, we have something like 400 species. But the key here into this idea of identifying these bees is that these specimens, they make habitat quality tangible, right? They connect that plant establishment idea with the floral resources and the actual ecological response from the bees. So we have 6 families of bees in Indiana. Some of these fairly can be identified by using some fairly simple features, but you're most likely going to require either a magnifying lens or a microscope, a stereoscope to see them, unless you're extremely familiar with these different bee species. The apids are the ones that everybody typically thinks of. These are our honeybees and our bumblebees. These are very common bees. Um, but they are not the majority of bee species. Actually, our sweat bees, the halictids, are the majority of the bees that we're likely to see, right? These are ground nesting bees. The andrenids, these are ground nesting bees. We call these mining bees, right? They all actually can nest in the ground and create these mines in the soil, and they tend to be smaller bees, but they're really interesting little bees if you take a quick look. The next family is Megachilidae. These are our leafcutter and mason bees, right? So many of you may be familiar with these mason bees. These are the ones that you can purchase the pupae. You can keep them in your little bee houses. These are a crevice dwellers, right? They like to nest in voids and woody structures. And you can buy reeds and stems that are hollowed out, and they make perfect habitat or perfect nesting sites for these bees. A couple families that you may not be so familiar with are these coletids, the coletidae. These are called plasterer or cellophane bees, and the Meletidae. These are specialists. Some carry them, call them oil-carrying bees. Um, these are they're not rare, but in our bee survey out at our sites over the last couple of years, we haven't run into one of them. So you're not as likely to encounter these as you are. Well, the meletids and the coletids are going to be the less common bee species that you find. All these other families are going to make up the majority of the bees that you see. So how do you tell a bee from some other look-alike insects? There are some simple features that can help. First of all, bees have two pairs of wings, right? That's going to separate them from flies. There are a lot of flies that have coloration that make them look like bees, but they're only ever going to have one pair of true wings. Bees are going to have longer, very obvious antenna, and they're going to have these very specialized pollen collecting structures or hairs called scopa on their body somewhere. They're often very hairy and often have these very wide legs for carrying pollen. And I'll show you some images of this. Flies, of course, are not going to have scopa. They're going to have very short antennae that are often hard to see. Their eyes often take up much of the face, and the eyes tend to be very close together. The legs are very short and tend to be very thin. Now, wasps are, of course, in that same order, insect order as bees, but they're going to be a little different. They're also going to have two pairs of wings, um, but their bodies are often very long and narrow. Their antennae tend to be long. They are not going to have scopy. They're not going to be very hairy. They tend to be very smooth bodied, and they often have this longer legs and a very slim or constricted waist. Those are sort of rule of thumb identification characteristics you can use to tell a bee from a fly and a wasp. All right, those are the groups that are most commonly misidentified as bees. All right, so if we look at our honeybees and bumblebees, these are the apidae. They have very specialized structures on their hind legs. We call pollen baskets. So they're flattened structures, and there's going to be hairs that um, sort of wrap around those structures, and those are made for carrying chunks of pollen. And you'll notice honeybees that have been out foraging often have their hind legs covered with pollen, right? Packed in there like into these boluses. And that's because they have these pollen baskets, and that's where they load the pollen to take it back to the colony. They also have these three submarginal cells on their forewings. That's going to be a little more difficult to see unless you have the aid of a magnifying lens or something similar. But look for those pollen baskets, those very flattened hind legs, to identify this group of bees. Our halictids or sweat bees, these are the majority of them are going to be ground nesting. They tend to be very shiny and metallic in color, at least on part of their body. They have pollen collecting hairs on their hind legs. You can see in this image very hairy hind legs, but they don't necessarily have those very flattened hind legs that form this very nice pollen basket. They have this very strongly curved basal vein in the forewing right here. You can see it um, with three submarginal cells again. The antennae, they tend to have this suture right below the antennae here. The arrow is pointing to it. They have one subantennal suture. But again, you're going to have to use a magnifying hand lens to see this. And even then, it can be difficult because the faces can be kind of hairy. I typically just go on that shiny green or blue metallic color. That's going to tell you, that's going to give you a clue if it's a halictid right away, and most of them have that characteristic. Our andrenids or mining bees, these are again ground nesters. They have pollen collecting hairs on their hind legs. They have very deep vertical facial grooves. Um, and you can see that here, like between the eyes and the antennae, there's a very deep depression. It's often obscured by hairs on the face, but if you take a close look at them, it becomes very obvious. They also have two subantennal sutures, not just one. So when the face is not incredibly hairy, you can see these two sutures. Look for that deeper groove. Here it's a dark color on this bee, but look for that deeper groove and the pollen carrying hairs on the hind legs. And if they're foraging, watching where they return to nest in the ground, those are good characteristics that give it away that it's an andrenid. The megachilids. All right, the leafcutters and mason bees. This is interesting because they collect pollen on their abdomen. That's where their scopa are located, right? They have very dense array of forked hairs on their abdomen, and that's where they pack that pollen. So you can see as they fly often, you'll see the underside of the abdomen is often coated with brightly colored pollen. That's pretty quickly identifiable as a megachilid. Um, that forewing has two submarginal cells, not three, as in the other species. And most of these are cavity nesters. So that makes them good for creating little colonies at the house that are kind of fun to watch and you can rear them. These bees are my wife and I keep a colony of them, a couple different species, and they're just a lot of fun. And they're incredibly docile. Like I have been stung by them, but it was by accident when I'd actually put my hand down on one of them and partially crush it or something. Then it will sting you, and then it kind of gets your attention. But it's like, was I just stung or was I not? They're very docile. They're very gentle bees, and that's why they make good colonies to keep around the house just for entertainment purposes or just interest. The caledids or cellophane bees, these are going to have one subantennal suture. They're going to have a very uh, obvious absence of what we call the pygidial plate. It's a covering for the last abdominal segment. It looks like this. And in other groups, you'll see it. In this group, you will not see that pygidial plate. But again, another feature that you're going to have to use magnification to assist. The milletids, this is that last group of oil-carrying bees that I talked about. They're really interesting looking bees. Um, they're in terms of characteristics, they're all over the board. Oftentimes they'll have this funny coloration. They'll either be blue or green stripes, sometimes white stripes. But other than that, they're a real mix mash of characters. Um, there are some wing venation characters that you can use, but this isn't a very common species, so I didn't figure it was worth getting into the nitty gritty on identifying this group. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Um, I thought maybe we should set some time aside to uh, to field questions. I know I covered a lot of ground pretty quickly here, but I think this is the fun part. We can ask questions, we can engage in some conversation, and I'll tell you what I know and what I don't know.
Absolutely. And if you have questions, you can throw those in the chat box. If not, we do have our post-program survey that helps us with our data points. One thing I wanted to mention is that I have seen quite a few people um, take this information and this research that you've done. And one of the big factors that they had to decide was what sort of size am I working with? Is it an acre? Is it 50 square feet? Is it a strip? But size was one of the first things that they're like, well, how much area am I going to use? Because I have seen when I take back roads home, there are entire fields where you can tell that they've planted their coneflower and pollinators, and that's what they're trying to do. But then I've also seen a little cottage where they just had probably about a 20-foot by 10-foot square and then two mower widths of turf grass to just have like a little hub. And then that was I want to call it a highly maintained prairie, if you will, because they had so many flowers and it was just always blooming even during the drought times. So that was really cool. And that was up near a house. So, just knowing what you can do. I do like the program. We are getting so far away from silver bullets anymore. There's no such thing as a silver bullet when you're talking about this sort of thing. So, just the planning of it all, it's fun. And I think this was a really well timed um, talk because now that we're getting through the dog days of summer, sit in the air conditioning and plan so they can get to it later on. So,
And
sorry,
I
that
like
was.
I like that you mentioned the different sizes, right? And it doesn't really matter. Smaller areas are easier to manage,
Mhm.
right? Start small, maybe work big. But, if you're looking at converting 50 acres to prairie, right? You've got your work cut out for you initially.
Yeah. Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. Everyone will get an email from Courtney. I'm going to go ahead and stop the. Oh, here we go. Wildlife returning to the area. How soon for pollinators? How soon for small mammals such as mice, rabbits, etc.? And what about large mammals?
Okay, that's a good question, Don. So pollinators almost right away. You see that as soon as you start to see blooms occurring, you're going to see a pollinator response. That's what we've observed, right? And it makes sense. They find their way in there from the larger landscape. The mice, the other wildlife, this is a matter of fragmentation, right? How far is this patch that you're planting? How far is it away from existing patches where wildlife are abundant, right? If it's a long ways, if it's an isolated patch, it can take some time for that wildlife to find that patch. If you're not that far away, I would expect it to happen pretty quickly, right? If you're planting a large area, that's even better because they'll find it more quickly. Um, birds will respond pretty quickly to this because there's plenty of insects in there for them to forage on. Deer and larger mammals, if you have them in the neighborhood, if you have them in the area, then they'll find that area and they will make use of it for what it's worth. But I guess bottom line is almost immediately in that first year, you can start to see some changes in terms of habitat use by these different groups of animals, including pollinators. Does that answer your question, Don?
Awesome.
Okay.
And while we're kind of wrapping up here, I did go ahead and put our season 8 topics. Just wanted to make a mention that for August 13th, we've got Teresa Rohde, who's going to highlight our Indiana Department of Natural Resources and the state park. And then we've got weed sciences coming up in September, composting with black soldier fly in October. And then we were actually able to get one of our geologist professors to talk about some geology things. So good talks coming up. I'm going to stop the recording, and we appreciate everyone coming out today, and joining us for Extension Hot Topics.
All right. Thanks, everyone.